All right, showing the clutch side with the seal, old seal still installed, and the bushing. One thing you'll note, the design of these seals, I think these are 6202/8 bearings or something like that. Anyway, on the clutch side, there's actually a lip on the bearing itself. So there's actually, the outer race does come up against the pocket here as it's installed, but it fits through the pocket here, and it's actually raised up above the crankcase plane, and that is fit within a groove, or accepted by a slight groove along the edge of the oiler housing. The seal here is roughly flush, but in actuality, at least the original one installed at the factory here on this saw, it's just ever so slightly, like probably just a thousandths or so of a millimeter above the plane of that outer race. And this bushing here that slides off right here, you can see it fits on the inside of the oil seal, and the bottom of this fits up against the inner race of the bearing. And I believe it's possible that the crankshaft can move freely, but most likely there's a fair chance that it might actually, this bushing might move with the crankcase. But regardless, this edge of the bushing is flush with the worm gear on the oiler, and the large washer, clutch washer, is pressed very tightly up against this bushing. Yeah, when you're cranking down the actual clutch or installing the clutch. And that's what essentially seals that bushing. If you were to pressure test this engine right now, you would, even if this was a new seal and wasn't leaking, you'd get an air leak right here. But that's not how you pressure test it. That will be sealed. It should be sealed. If that is leaking, you have to test it with the clutch and the clutch washer on. Then you know that you have to replace that bushing. So you can make a decision whether it's worth replacing that bushing anyway. Most likely not, but just kind of a FYI on how that is, the whole crankshaft and seal and bearing situation on the clutch side is set up on an 044 and a 440. On the flywheel side, you can see that the smaller seal is recessed quite a bit. I've measured that with a caliper, and if we call this the outer case plane right here, the oil seal is installed about 3.9 millimeters below that. And there is an inner edge of the case, which we could call the inner plane. You might even be able to see that slightly up against the edge of the seal. And the seal is basically flush up against that. The sealing mandrel for installing this seal should install the seal to the correct depth, but basically it needs to be far enough below that plane so that it can it's not interfering with the flywheel here. So just kind of an FYI on what you're looking, what you have to watch out for. And if you're not using the OEM pressing sleeves for the oil seals, then this is why it's important to take note of how they're installed before you remove the old ones, so that you can install them using a proper socket, deep socket, to the correct depth. Just use a caliper to take your measurements. Bowman out. All right, fellow chainsaw geeks, we got a white crankcase here, Stihl 044. So a little update on that teardown to get ready for the rebuild. So it was incredibly dirty, as you may have been able to see from the previous videos, and it just needed to be cleaned up better, and the only way to do that was some degreaser. So I was able to use Super Clean. a little bit easier to deal with disposal relative to using a conventional engine degreaser, and it did fine. As you can see, I had to take off the chain tensioner. I've also taken off the remainder of the chain brake, the exhaust. Just had to be able to get down to the saw so that I could clean it, because the rest of the saw was just as dirty. So you can see there's the exhaust side. Now I have it, after I've cleaned it up, I had it sealed when I was cleaning it up using Super Clean. But now I've got it sealed, and the piston on both the intake and the exhaust is in absolute pristine shape. I just don't want to have to take this jug off if I don't need to. If I really wanted to get a little more of the gunk off on the fins down here on the drive side, as well as on this side of the crankcase, I'd have to take the jug off, but I'm just gonna fight doing that right now. I just don't think it's necessary. It's not that bad. But everything else has been cleaned up. To get back in here and get this cleaned up, I had to take off the ignition components. No big deal. Everything was dirty, so I'm glad I did take it off. Been able to seal the intake here. Both of these are going to get replaced. It was really manky down under here as well. So now we've got a nice clean saw, and waiting for parts to arrive so that we could start putting it back together. Incidentally, there's a foil protector here and one up on the underneath side of the handbrake that I am going to replace with just some, you can get foil tape. It's just exactly the same stuff. But I needed to take those off. They were in pretty tough shape, and I needed to get underneath here. You can see the saw got a little hot over on this side of the crankcase. You can see it here, and you can even see it up in here. Compared to the rest of the crankcase, that's probably what's caused the discoloration. But again, the piston and cylinder are in pristine shape, so it may have gotten a little hot once upon a time, but it wasn't for very long, and nothing to cause any concern. So hopefully, if I operate it, or one of my other co-workers from now on, start taking better care of this saw and keep it periodically cleaned up a little bit better so it doesn't get quite so manky. But at any rate, the next videos you'll probably see me pulling the seals here so that we can assess the crank bearings. And then once we've, assuming the crank bearings are fine, then we won't have to break open the saw, and then I'll replace those seals, and then we'll start rebuilding the saw, starting with the exhaust and the components on the clutch side, then the ignition, and then we'll fit these intake components here before we get ready to put the tank assembly and carburetor back on. So, cheers. Bowman out. All right, we use a Stihl oil seal puller. Pull the oil seals, clutch side, 3.1 jaw. We just slip this in along the side of the crankshaft, being careful not to scrape it. And actually remove the bushing, makes it a lot easier to slip this in here. Tighten the wing nuts. You get that up against the seal. So you just tighten these two wing nuts. You got to try and keep this stem centered so that it sits right down in the drive shaft, and you got to tighten these just right. so that things line up, and you keep the jaws lined up so that they grab the seal. It's not quite as easy as it appears. See, it's not straight up and down, so seems like it would be a lot easier to get it aligned, but it's not, so you just gotta monkey with it. You're trying to guard against damaging crankcase as well as the crank bearing. You got to get it tight enough up against the actual metal lip of the seal so that it doesn't pull through the rubber. And if you tighten one side too much, then it'll get out of alignment. All right, I think we finally got it. All All right, now I'm going to tighten down the center screw on the puller, and I don't know if you can see that. See how it's just pulled it right out, nice and easy. Houston, we have a problem. And see what I'm seeing there? That's an extremely dirty bearing. 25-year-old saw. Very dirty bearing. That really needs to be replaced. I'm afraid that means the crankcase is going to have to get split. Much bigger job. Have to find out if it's even worth proceeding based upon the cost and investment. All right, not sure if you'll be able to see this very well as I work on it, but it's the same premise as pulling the seal off of the clutch side. Very tiny seal compared to the clutch side, and on these pullers you end up installing a number 6 jaw. Of course, this isn't the only way you can remove a seal, but that's how we're going to remove these. So again, you got to insert this in along the edge of the drive shaft, being careful not to score the drive shaft. As you could see from the video I showed of the clutch side, clearly there was an oil leak on that clutch side. That's why it was so damn dirty. This seal appeared to be much tighter, so I'm guessing that this seal was probably fine. However, based on the clutch side, notice that it was quite hard and brittle. So there's really no reason why this seal, being 25 years old, would really be any different than that. And you can see there it's pulling right out just fine. There we go. Now we're going to inspect the crankshaft. Make sure we didn't do any damage on the sealing surface, and it doesn't look like we did. And we'll bring you in here, but while not as bad as the clutch side, I don't know if you can see, but it's pretty tight space, but there's definitely quite a bit of dirt and grime in there on that bearing as well. So clearly this saw needs a complete rebuild, and it's not going to happen. So this is going to become parts. So next video, I guess, will just show the process of taking the jug off and splitting the case. All right, sorry about that, guys. All you've missed so far is I've loosened the cylinder bolts, And I'm taking the last bolt off just before we pop the cylinder off and start getting a closer look at it. There we go. Definitely got a lot of carbon. Not a lot of piston wear. You know, again, the piston doesn't look terribly bad. Neither do the rings. We don't have any scoring really, so you know, actually I think the piston can be reused. I did not realize that we would be looking at what appears to be a metal gasket. You know, I don't know that it can be reused. Maybe. Let's see if I can get you a little closer. So yeah, you see a little bit of oil here, but there's a little bit of wear there, but there really isn't a whole lot of wear on the piston. I think it's in good shape. Notice how the bottom end is in good shape. There's not a lot of crap there. So it would appear as though there was a leak from the outside on both of the seals, and it was starting to get things dirty. The inside of the crankcase and the crankshaft is not in bad shape. They can all be reused. So I think it does need bearings. There's an outside chance maybe I can clean the bearings, but you know, they just need to come out, so they're not going to be reusable. So there is a chance that let's take a look at the cylinder here. There is not, well, there's no scoring. It might be worth trying to see if we can hone this cylinder and reuse it. I'll maybe touch base with a buddy of mine that does more of this kind of stuff and see if I've never reused a cylinder. Well, I have, but this one's got, looks like some glazing. Just not sure that I can rehone this and reuse the cylinder or not, but that's a possibility. Otherwise, we're looking at a pretty good investment to get a new cylinder, which if I'm going to do that, I might as well get the piston, so a whole cylinder assembly. That might be the next investment for this saw. Not sure that the customer is going to be willing to drop that much additional money. All right, so now it's just a function of getting the circlips out, which is fairly straightforward. I'll use a pick to get the circlips out, drive out the piston pin here, and take off the piston. You can see there's quite a bit of glazing and varnishing up here in the bottom of the piston, so that's not a good thing. So I think maybe we will just replace the piston on this. Take it from there. All right. I'll get the piston off and a few other things off, and then when it's time to start removing the case bolts and popping open the crankcase, I'll be back at you.